This new series of conversations we're having are going to be on the subject of self-discovery, and what we're going to base it on really is your book called Internal Power, 7 Doorways to Self-Discovery. And if I may, I'd suggest that we first of all do an overview of, not of the book as such, but of self-discovery and the process that you explain in the book. The process consists of the 7 doorways, the 7 steps, and what we could do is, after the overview, we could take each one of those steps one by one and go into them in more detail. So what we might perhaps do is to look at what self-discovery is, and how it leads to the culmination that you describe in the book of developing unconditional love. Because unconditional love is really what you spend your time inspiring people to develop these days. And it's interesting that you published this book in 1993, which is quite some time before you launched the Love Foundation. So evidently there's some sort of process that you went through to get to that stage. And as you say in the book, you went through this process of self-discovery yourself. So you're writing it on the basis of your personal experience. And what I'd suggest is that whilst I know that the viewers would like to know, a bit more about you and how the Love Foundation came about and what that does, I think it would be good if you could incorporate that kind of information into what you're saying as we go along. And that would work well, really, because we are talking about your personal experience as well as the process that you're suggesting other people could go through. So let's start, shall we, with an overview of what self-discovery is. Could you take it from there?
Sure. For me, self-discovery is really came about at a point in my life where I made a rather significant transition from less of an external view on life, action, reaction to all the things that were happening in my life externally, to an inner perspective, an inner focus of my understanding of who I was and who I am within. And this transition, I literally dubbed kind of the self-discovery experience. It was for me, that is for many people, when they begin to question their beliefs, their traditions, their experiences in life, and they begin to want to know more. They want to go beyond just the daily routines, the habits, the various things we do in family and career, in community and nation, and they begin to question on a deeper level. And I can say that for me, by my personal journey, there was a point of which, while I was in business and management and finance, and actually in banking, when all of this started to transpire in a more conscious way, I had gone through all of my college and had my master's degree in business, and I had been working full-time through that same period. And there was always this understanding based on what I had grown up with, the suggestions, beliefs, the traditions of, my culture, my community, my family. The career path was pretty well known. The relationship, expectations were pretty much, what we all kind of collectively seemingly agreed upon, although not realizing any of this. There was an inner stirring that began to happen to me, where I started to realize that all of what I was doing in my external experiences, in work and home and the people and friends, I was doing what I thought was right. Everything I was doing seemed to be appropriate according to the conditioning that I was brought up under. And yet there was this inner stirring, this inner awakening, this inner unsettledness, unhappiness that I started to recognize and acknowledge. And this inner stirring really was this recognition that although I was doing everything right, I wasn't happy inside.
Was that just sort of there in the background? Or did you...
It was in the background I'm sure, much, much longer than I really perceived, because I wasn't really acknowledging it or understanding it. And yet it got louder and louder in my inner world. The contrast between what I was doing and what I was experiencing and the joy that I was actually seeking, the contrast, the chasm between those, its own right was growing in such a way that it came to a point where I had to start to acknowledge it. Mm-hmm. And once I did start to acknowledge it, once I started to explore me, at the time the catch-all phrase was self-help, self-growth. So I started to acquire books on a whole variety of self-help, self-growth, subjects and presentations, cassette tapes, all kinds of things that I could put my hands on. And I really started to dive in with this desire to understand me. And this transition was really where I started to focus less on what I was doing in my external world and pursuing goals and hopes and dreams and things that I had come to believe would make me happy. And I started to focus more on me. And I can say personally that beginning parts of the journey became very fascinating, very interesting and intriguing to me, more so than following typical career paths or following habits and routines and rituals. And that transition, that shift from an outer focus to an inner focus was quite monumental. I mean, many, many things began to change in my life as a result of that. And that exploration was something that was stimulated, that the seed was there inside me, and yet it took my active engagement to cultivate it, to nurture it, to help it, grow and sprout and bloom and blossom in ways that, of course, I would have never even imagined at the time how it would have brought me to the experiences I'm having today. So the self-discovery process is innate within everyone. The seed is there. And I'm sure on many, many cases that people are having these whispers and perhaps even, at times the kind of the loud comments that are saying, okay, stop and reflect, take time, go within, begin to understand who we are in relationship to life around us. When we heed that call, that begins really the self-discovery process. We begin to understand who we are in relationship to everything and everyone around us. And that really expands our journey in this life in multidimensional ways and in ways we can't even begin to fathom at the time we embark, because we begin to move beyond the action and reaction of life and become more directly conscious creators. We become more conscious of our thoughts and our feelings. We become more conscious of how we are actually participating in life and have much greater control over our experiences than we are led to believe. This inner journey really does begin to reveal just how powerful and how much potential each of us has. And in my own self-exploration, the self-discovery that I have gone through and continue to go through every moment of every day, it became obvious to me that in the many, many books that I was reading subject materials. I was reading, really profound ideas, but they were all more or less separate from each other. And in this rapid growth that I went through, and really in a process of perhaps, matter of just a year or two, I had read so much material that I started to formulate my own understanding that all of this was interconnected. It was all interrelated, and that you couldn't separate out, really, truly separate out, say, positive thinking from our creative nature. You couldn't separate out this understanding about love with our ability to choose. That they were, in fact, and are, in fact, all synergistically related. And the self-discovery process isn't really step 1, 2, 3 or ABC. It is an ongoing spherical experience where all of these things are growing in their own way in a non-linear fashion. And that was another thing that was really quite fascinating to me in the self-discovery, that not everything in life was as linear, one foot in front of the next, as I had been led to believe or had come to understand or had been taught. That in fact there were so many more things that I could do to even change the very nature of my experience of time. I could change, the time it took to make things happen, the amount of effort, the amount of struggle, the amount of resistance, the amount of ease, the amount of joy. These things were all far more a part of my consciousness than I had ever been aware of. So self-discovery for me was and is a beautiful and exponential expansion of our experience, in this journey of life. It is something that we can actually take on.
Yeah, wasn't it pretty confusing and scary to begin with?
Oh, absolutely. In those first stages, absolutely. The awareness that seemed to be scary, and think about it from this example, is when we strive to keep a sense of balance and security in our life, we will do things, oftentimes even detrimental things, in an effort to keep our life, on an even keel. We like stability. Human nature creatures, we like stability. We want everything. We want to know that what was there yesterday will be there tomorrow. Mm-hmm. We think there's some safety in that, and yet life is constant change. We can never step our toe in the same river twice and have the same experience. It is constant change. So the change is something that we're not accustomed to. And when you first begin to be aware and discover self, that change is not so much a fear of the unknown, which is in fact, what we think, okay, we're stepping into areas that we've never explored before. It's really about the shift from letting go of the safety, what we perceive as safety, and letting go and allowing ourselves to go beyond what we've known about ourselves, to realize that there's great responsibility in our creations, there's great potential in what we are thinking and feeling. And all of a sudden we go from this, action-reaction perspective to being more of a conscious creator of our lives. And, comes with a level of intention, responsibility. It comes with a level of understanding. And in those early stages, I have always likened to it the metaphor of the old train. Our life is an old train coming into station. It slows down to a point where it will stop. And in the self-discovery process, if you want to take kind of the metaphor of a train leaving the station, there's a time period where, the old train is slowing down and the new train is picking up momentum. And in that process, we're switching tracks, we're switching trains. There's a whole new train available to us. And that initially to our psyche, to our ego, to our outer nature is scary because, it doesn't know where the new train's going. I certainly didn't. I thought in those very early stages that this self-discovery process was just going to more or less enhance aspects of what I was already doing. In other words, my career, my family, my relationships, my friends, where I lived, all these things were going to be more or less, stable, just with more insight. Mm-hmm. For me personally, that is not what happened. For me, it was a complete and utter 180 in my life. And it was almost as if I started a whole new lifetime. And certainly I can say that from this time period when this initial inner awareness began to take form and take shape in my life, and I began to really explore it, that my life took off in dimensions and ways that I literally could never have expected. I would have never expected to be writing books. I would have never expected to have a TV show or doing interviews or setting up a foundation a decade later that has a global impact and influence, that I'd be inspiring people to love unconditionally. These were so far from my, previous experiences of, being business management and banking and finance and, very routine, almost to me now mundane experiences in comparison to the idea of getting up every morning now for over 2 decades and literally creating my day from moment to moment. Mm-hmm. And so truly an amazing difference in the self-discovery and worth all those initial scary moments, because what does happen is we do get more comfortable in our awareness of our ability to create. In fact, that our ability to create was and is happening when we're unconscious of it also. So all we're doing is becoming more aware of our thoughts and our feelings and our perspectives and making conscious choice in that process.
Well, thankfully we can learn from your experience, but it must have taken quite some time because you've developed a kind of this process, a step-by-step process, but it must have been quite some time before you realized that it was a step-by-step process that was needed.
Well, not so much a step-by-step. I can say that I laid out kind of a framework relatively quickly. I mean, given the time period of when I started to become aware of myself and these great vast ideas, these great potentials. One of the things that happened fairly quickly, as I said a moment ago, is that this interrelatedness, interconnectedness became obvious to me. And where I could sit there at a table and look at, say, a couple of dozen books that I'd read, and I could almost pile them into piles and say they were on these various subjects, I realized that they were all related, that you couldn't necessarily say that one was happening at one point and another was happening at another point. It wasn't linear anymore. Although the way it was being presented seemed very linear, there was this pervasive understanding that they were happening in various degrees all the time. So what happened for me actually is I sat down one day and I said, what are the key areas? What are the main things? And I wrote out a list of 7 key areas. And, kind of formulating the idea like, well, what if there was, a way to combine and summarize all these things? And that was kind of my formulating intention, because I was rapidly becoming aware in this first year that I was most obviously not going to go back into banking. Because one of the things that I had done is I had moved from where I had been living, moved quite a distance away, and then unbeknownst to me, even in those first steps, I was really changing my life dramatically, because I was no longer in the same community, did not have the same friends, into new relationships, new experiences, just having such an enormous amount of change going on in the same time period that I was doing tremendous amount of personal research and inner understandings and inner work, in a way, letting go, forgiving, releasing. There was just a lot of things going on. So these 7 areas that I wrote down had to happen fairly rapidly conceptually. In other words, I had not just taken one particular idea and really, like, say, positive thinking. I didn't read 50 books on positive thinking and make my life about that. I was interested and intrigued about all these different areas. And as I read through and applied and worked through so many of these different areas, that's when I became aware of the fact that they were connected, and that there was a purpose in understanding that they were really an ongoing expansion that was simultaneous in a way. It was no longer in linear fashion. 2 weeks later, after I'd written out this initial list, I sat back down and looked at it, and I realized what I had started the list with, interestingly enough, was unconditional love. And unconditional love wasn't one of the areas that there was a lot written about or that people really were exploring. It was more about maybe essences of love. But, I understood that unconditional love almost immediately was the pervasive energy that was the cohesive piece that ran through all of these. And I'm sure that's why I wrote it down, initially first, but it was somewhat symbolic and almost prophetic as to what I would be doing later in subsequent years, because at that point, it wasn't the strongest, but it was the first thing I wrote down. And the 7th thing I'd written down in that original list was choice. I took that list and I rewrote it, and I flipped them around, and I made choice the first one. And unconditional love was the last of the 7 doorways. And in that, there was like this instant recognition that the whole self-discovery process begins in this cornerstone of choice, that we have choice. And the choice isn't about all the things we act and react to in our outer lives. That choice is certainly, a very potent piece, because we do make decisions, every day, all through the day. What I had become aware of is that it wasn't about making choices about the physical things. It was about making choices about my perspectives, my thoughts, and my feelings. Because in fact, when I started to choose different thoughts and different feelings, my physical world changed as a result. So the choice, the potential, the power, the internal power that we all have is in our ability to choose differently. We can choose different thoughts and different feelings, take ourselves from more negative perspectives to more positive perspectives. And when we do, we expand our view on life, and that naturally changes our very experience of life. Mm-hmm. So the process was actually fairly quick, if you took it in the sense of even happening over like a year from this part of kind of an initial awakening to actually beginning to write out, what was I learning about myself. And then literally from that list came, applying it to a few workshops where I was living, to a few groups, and realizing, and honing and cultivating that to writing a book, within the second year. And part of that writing that initial manuscript was because I felt like the thing that was missing out there in the world, in the self-help world, the self-growth arena, was nobody was pulling it all together. Nobody was taking all these aspects and bringing them together to help people see how they were interconnected. And so all of this evolved relatively quickly when you consider that the book itself, when having never written, was probably a good B student in English, never saw myself as a writer, still don't see myself as a writer, and yet I was able to write this book beginning to end straight through in less than 6 weeks. So enormously rapid shifts given the bigger scheme of our lifetime. For some people, maybe 2 years sounds like a lot of time, but for me, to have made such an enormously huge change in my life in such a brief time, it was really quite exponential and really quite rapid. And I do believe that people, if they give themselves the freedom and the space to discover more of themselves, the self-discovery process in its initial burst does and can happen quite rapidly. Now, as I also mentioned earlier, the self-discovery process never ends. I'm still discovering me right this moment. So the self-discovery keeps growing in so many different ways that one could liken it to, a branch or a tree that keeps branching out, branching out, branching out. It just keeps flowing in a kind of a fractal, using math, a kind of a fractal sense. And today's growth, today's discovery is no less amazing than it was a couple of decades ago. Mm-hmm. I think the difference is that back then it was so hugely different from the way it had been living that it was very obvious that there was major growth, major change, major, it was real clear that I was experiencing something very different than I had been experiencing. Today it's far more subtle, and yet the growth, the discovery is no less rich and no less amazing. It just has a different, now it's got, a couple of decades of experience, so it's used to growing all the time. Back then, it had never even thought about the idea of growing and expanding and discovery, so it was, monumental. Obviously, I get very passionate and excited about this, and have maintained a passion and excitement, for these many years, because in contrast to the way I had been living, the previous life, the routines, the habits, the careers, the experiences, the relationships, the friendships, seem almost two-dimensional in comparison to now, where friendships, for example, are so multidimensional, so vastly different, because there's so much freedom of expression and forgiveness and unconditional love and embracing and compassion. Very different than way back when a friendship was structured so strongly based on social conditioning. Mm-hmm. And of course it's hard for someone that hasn't gone through this experience to fully understand, perhaps what I'm saying at this moment, but maybe over the course of this video series, if people follow along, they will come to understand more in their own life how this really grows in amazing ways from within.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds as if there's a huge amount to look forward to in one's life through going through this process, but do we all have to expect a period of dramatic change, and if so, how long does it go on before some sort of stability starts developing?
Dramatic change would be relative to the person's perspective. Maybe that isn't always the best word. Every person's experience is going to be unique unto themselves. So people are discovering themselves whether they're aware of it or not. So over the course of a lifetime of many decades, there is a discovery process that's going on, in one way or another, somewhat aware. So in the old world, I can say that I actually had more drama in my habitual routine life, because I was constantly unaware and acting and reacting some more to everything that was happening to me, and having all these judgments and criticisms and guilt and worries and just so much energy not understanding what I was experiencing. So in a way, the old way of living was very much more dramatic in its sense, but with no no framework within which to understand why that drama was happening. So for me, the dramatic shifts that I say happened in this exchange and this kind of a 180 in my life was really as I let go of that old drama and found greater and greater freedom, I grew in ways that shed kind of that old skin, shed that old way of looking at life. And yet, as kind of a bridge during this initial quick phase, some of those old dramas, kind of came in and repeated themselves. So it was where I wasn't fully anchored in more of myself. There was definitely, a bit of struggle at times to let go, a bit of, inner strength and courage to take the next step to really make fundamental shifts, both internally and externally in my life. It did take a level of courage to move forward. Mm-hmm. That process will be unique for everyone. Some people have a much easier time letting go. I may have had a much harder time letting go initially. So for some people, they might go through a really rapid self-discovery process, and it could be just like, kind of from one moment to the next into instant bliss. And they didn't have to go through any of it. Other people may take this same thing that I went through fairly rapidly and take it over the rest of their lifetime. Mm-hmm. There is no race. There is no goal. There is no end. There is no place we have to get. There is no I did it faster than you did it, or I had more struggle than you did, or I had more joy than you did. None of that really comes into play because the whole self-discovery is about ourselves, to find our own strengths, our own weaknesses, our own abilities. It really is about the journey. It's not about the destination. That did take me a little while to understand, because certainly when you go through all this, amazing inner explosive awareness, there's kind of like a desire to run out there and get into the world. I think, even writing books and stuff was kind of like, I did this to share with the world. I've now understood that it is unique unto ourselves, and no one actually need undergo this self-discovery process consciously if they don't want to. I mean, there is no right or wrong, good or bad. There is no have to or not have to. It's simply an opportunity that is a seed in everybody. Mm-hmm. And to the degree that they cultivate it, certainly in my case, I think when this seed sprouted and began to take form, I nurtured it, I fertilized it, I gave it pretty much my full attention. So that's no doubt a great reason why mine was so rapid, is because I kind of dove in head first. Now, people have different circumstances. They might not have the time and the ability and even the desire to do that much introspection. Mm-hmm. For them, there may be so many things that they contend with in the outer world that they can only give a little bit of time, and they want to take it in different types of steps. So it is going on all the time. To the degree we cultivate it, to the degree we allow ourselves to expand, we will have our own unique experience. And that's the beauty of it. It doesn't need to look like anybody else's. It's no longer about following social constraints or listening to what I have to say. There are no 1, 2, 3 steps. They really are doorways of discovery, as I shared in my book, because there are areas that you can go out into. You can explore. When you're done exploring, if you've had enough, you come back in and shut the door, get back into the routine. And then when you're ready, go down and figure, that same door, go down another door. I mean, this isn't something that is meant to be, a certificate. It isn't something you go out and say, look, I did this. It is ongoing. The difference is, for me, the old world was much more unconscious. And now I'm much more conscious. I'm much more present. I understand the present moment, the now moment. I understand being alive and present right here, right now, rather than, dwelling in the past or looking forward to some imaginative future, when it can all come together. It's all about being present, being alive, being aware, being conscious. And for me, of course, it has evolved innately with the whole idea of love. It's about expressing love in this moment, which we'll get into more as we kind of explore the various self-discovery doorways.
Well, I guess the process would pay dividends in all sorts of different ways, different aspects of your life. I mean, the book, as you wrote it originally, was called Internal Power. I mean, that was the main heading on the book, wasn't it? So in all sorts of ways, one's own internal power is enhanced. But you're saying that it really, ideally, the culmination is the development of unconditional love, and how that will then express in your life and really inform everything about your life, I guess.
Certainly based on my exploration and in this time period, I did not limit myself to any particular type of teaching, any particular type of method. I was like a great sponge, and I was then at that point where I was not that curious about much of anything that didn't relate to my outer world previously. I more or less did things according to what I needed to learn for my business or what I need to do for career, for cultivating the odd friendship here and there. The self-discovery process, opened me up, and I became this truly a sponge where I just wanted to know everything about everything. And I didn't take any particular course of action so much as I let books call to me. I let experiences happen, and I allowed myself to explore things that I hadn't really been even seemingly interested in prior to this. And the concept of love, I had actually, one of the things I'd looked at, it was a wonderful summary book on all the religions, because I had not really had a religious background, and to this day still don't have a religious affiliation, because I always found that it's all bigger than that. That there's a much bigger understanding going on. But by looking at, for example, this one book on all the various spiritual traditions, the thing that was so obvious to me that was not even expressed in the book is that in each summary of each major religion, who the original teacher was that brought about what became a religion based on that teaching, the message was absolutely in every situation was love. And so I was finished with this rather thick book, and I put it down, and I'm like, well, every master teacher had one message. It was about love. Every religion should have been based basically upon that master teacher's message of love, and in many ways, did strive to it. However, have been somewhat convoluted since then in most instances. But the idea didn't matter about what the religion was. It was about the key message was love. So I very quickly understood that love was an important aspect of our beingness on this planet and in our life journey. So I brought that piece in quickly, and yet, as I've said several times already, I cultivated that love aspect and continue to cultivate it, so many years later. And I've seen in my own personal life that love does appear to be the reason we're here. So all of the self-discovery is really to understand the love that is at the heart center of our nature. The very core of who we are is love. Most people spend, their entire lifetime exploring and seeking love outside of themselves. And the self-discovery process helps us understand that it's right here within us. It's never not with us. And all the seeking, just simply listen to the radio programs and the countless songs that we hear on music. The vast majority are seeking love. They're talking about love, in relationships, physiologically, sexually, emotionally, mentally, but almost all songs are in one way or another based on love. And music being such a prominent part of our journey on this planet, it says something about us looking externally for something when in fact, when you start to discover yourself, you realize that it's right there within. And that we've gotten this whole journey inside out and backwards. We're looking outside of ourselves when in fact we need to be realizing and focusing within ourselves, because that's where all the power is. That's where the internal power is. That's where the love is. That's where the choice is. That's where the creativity is. All these things are happening whether we're fully aware of it or not. And the self-discovery allows us to be much more conscious of our path and our journey.
Okay, well, take us through each of these 7 doorways then. Would you just briefly, but give us just an insight into each one of these doors, and then then we'll be able to go into each one of them a bit deeper. Next time we're talking.
Well, certainly the cornerstone that I mentioned is choice. And the beauty of choice is that it brings our personal power back to ourselves. We have choice over the thoughts and feelings we have. And how we think and how we feel about life creates and impacts the experience we have. And when we realize that we can change our perspective, we can look at things in a bigger way, choice becomes our point of power. It's the place where we are physically, emotionally, mentally, and shall we say broadly, spiritually, one in this present moment. So we can't do anything about the past. The future will take care of itself, but it really all happens right here and right now. And when we understand the present moment and we understand that we have choice, we can change the way we think. If we have an inner critical thought, we can say, okay, thank you, a critical thought. I think I'm going to think differently about this. And if we start to feel, somehow fat or ugly or not feeling good about ourselves, we can stop and reflect and acknowledge the fact that, oh, this is an interesting feeling. Thank you. I don't choose to feel this way anymore. And we can start to feel, we can feel differently. We can feel more joyful. We can feel more happy. We can feel more alive. And certainly we'll explore ways we can do that, how we can affect, these changes at times when we don't always have seemingly the tools initially. There's certainly lots of ways to help us in this process. Well, thoughts and feelings directly relate to communication, both internal and external. So from choice, we need to begin to pay attention to our inner communication. Most people are absorbed about, who they're talking to and what they're talking about. And even then, they don't actually act as an observer of what they're saying externally, much less do they pay attention to what they're thinking internally. Communication is going on all the time. Our body constantly communicates to itself and to us. The cells talk to each other in order to even have this physical body that we walk around in. There's communication going on in our thoughts and our feelings. There are experiences that are calling to us all the time to say, hey, pay attention. We just haven't been trained. We haven't been reminded. We haven't been shown the power of our thinking and our feeling. So we take this next doorway of communication as a way to understand who we are internally and externally, because certainly not only are there internal cues, but if we do start paying attention to how we communicate externally, there's a lot to be gained in the self-discovery process in paying attention to what we're saying to people and how we're acting out in the world, which then gives us the chance to choose differently, which is the next doorway of the positive thinking. Now we get to realize that it's not about good or bad thoughts or positive or negative thoughts, but we have the ability to change and expand to more unlimited thoughts, more unlimited thinking. So positive thinking is really an area where we begin to apply what we're understanding about the way we've been doing it and the way we'd like to do it, which naturally leads into the next component, the next doorway of creativity. Well, we're all creative beings. If we are able to change our thoughts and feelings and therefore change our reality, if we're able to imagine something differently, then we're able to create. In fact, we are creating all the time. Even in habits and routines, we're creating, which then gives us the opportunity to understand more of our thoughts and our feelings, understand more of the nature of who we are at our core, which is a balance of energies. And I liken it to masculine and feminine energies. We all have masculine and feminine energies within. We have our ability to imagine, nurture, all these feminine energies that are holistic and tremendously valuable and important aspects of who we are, combined with our ability to take imagination, use our willpower, which is a masculine energy, and actually manifest things in our world. We all have this, whether we recognize it or not. And to bring masculine and feminine energies into greater balance is absolutely cornerstone too in the next level of understanding, so that we can create differently through our positive thinking, communicate differently internally and externally, all because we have choice. So as we're beginning to understand our masculine and feminine energies, we also need to recognize that all of these conditionings, these rituals, these social structures, these things that we've been taught from everyone and everything around us really come from our childhood in their initial stages. We are most formative in our earliest stages of our childhood, to where we are kind of coming into our own, we're kind of beginning to understand the world in ways, and we're taking in instruction basically from people, places, and things, experiences, and everything during these formative years. The challenge is, as budding humans, we also don't necessarily have reference points because we don't have all the experiences. So we find that we have this kind of inner child, this aspect of ourselves that kind of walks with us through our entire lifetime, that keeps creating and recreating based on what it learned in its childhood, the good, the bad, and everything in between, as we would say, just in a dual reference, but not in a good and bad sense. But all the things we learn, this conditioning is part of who we are, and to explore where we came from as a child and what we were exposed to, and begin to realize that we ourselves can begin to choose differently right now. So it doesn't matter what we were taught, it's what we choose to think about life now. It doesn't matter what the beliefs were that were passed on generation to generation, it's what we choose to think now. And so the child within is an enormously powerful opportunity to recognize that not everything that we learned was for our benefit. It was really just something that was being passed on, perhaps one fear to the next, one doubt to the next, from one person to the next. It doesn't have to be our way of living. So to address this child within, to nurture this child within, to understand this childlike nature that is innately in all of us, that goodness, that exploration, that curiosity, the really beautiful pieces about our childhood that are just as vital and important today, to bring that energy back forth and be curious about life itself, that is the positive aspect. We'll bring all of these explorations together, and you come upon this realization that unconditional love is the next obvious place to explore, embody, and bring to ourselves, is the pure self-acceptance, the unconditional self-acceptance, the unlimited self-acceptance, the releasing of all the beliefs and traditions that no longer serve us, the outmoded, outdated things, and explore the love that is within us as a choice. Because in fact, when you do go through the self-discovery, there is a natural unfolding of self-love, self-appreciation. And I say this from a self standpoint because what we have within, we give out. What we give out, we get back. If we are outer seeking and we constantly seek outside ourselves for love, we'll never get it because we don't realize we have it within. But in the self-discovery process, we begin to understand ourselves so deeply, so intently, so intimately, and so vulnerably. We begin to realize just how loved, lovable, loving we are. And we start to have compassion for ourselves. And this is not a selfish type of experience. This is actually very selfless, because in fact, when we understand the love we have within, it's the love we give out. The love we give out is what returns. It's the circle of life. And yet, think about just that understanding. We go from an experience before our discovery of really not even understanding love, constantly seeking, striving, taking whatever we can from everything and everyone around us, to understanding the power and potential and the love we have within. We begin sharing it selflessly. So this love, this important piece that we need to understand, is that it all begins with pure self-acceptance. Because if we can't accept ourselves, it's impossible to accept anyone else. If we can't accept our experiences, it's impossible to accept the experiences around us. So unconditional love, as I think you even referenced, somewhat of a pinnacle of the self-discovery journey. It too never ceases, because we keep finding more and more love to express. But if we weave this unconditional love back through all these doorways and go back to the child within, bring love there, and bring love to our masculine, feminine energies, bring love back into creation and creativity, bring love back into positive thinking, bring love back into our communication, bring it back to a fundamental choice. Every moment of every day choosing to express and expand more love. That, to me, is the self-discovery process. There is no A to B, or A to C, or 1 through 7. They're all really happening simultaneously. We just tend to take pieces more one moment from the next and explore them a little bit more intimately from one moment to the next. But it really is all happening at the same time. So that's it in a nutshell. That as I have explored it, and I'm certainly many more ways. And this is just something that I've brought forth as from my experience. Understandings as a way to help others more quickly understand when they're going through this process naturally, as a way to bring it all together, as a way to kind of not so much speed up the process, but really get rid of the bumps and the obstacles, because I went through plenty of those myself. And if I can help another not have to go through all of those quite the way I did, then I feel like my journey has assisted another, just as so many other people's journeys helped me even begin this process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's obviously quite a lot more we could explore inside each one of those doorways anyway, isn't there? So
Yep.
let's do that. But for now, thanks very much. Thanks, Harold.
Pleasure.